was revolutionaries who swept Europe and brought down feudalism, you know? Revolutionaries who brought us the concept of the rights of man, life, liberty, property, liberty, equalite, fraternity. That all came about because these revolutionaries began toppling the old social institutions and trying to push for something that was more progressive and more scientific and gave a better life to people. And Marxism, as a political movement, emerged in the aftermath of all of that. Among those who looked at these new societies created by the overthrow of feudalism and basically said that they were disappointed, right? Serfdom was replaced by wage slavery, right? The kings and the nobles were replaced by factory owners and bankers. Greed and selfishness, which had been restricted under the old social order, became the basis of the whole economy. And if something was wrong, you know, that the revolutions in which society had been mobilized to overthrow the kings and fight for human rights and liberty and freedom, it had left a lot of people behind. It hadn't delivered on the glory that it had promised. Marxism, and Karl Marx taught us, first of all, there are two classes. There is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There are those who own the major centers of economic power, the factories, the banks, the means of transport, the means of communication, and make profits from them. And then there are the rest of us who sell our labor power to those capitalists in order to survive. We get wages. We live by working. We're proletarians. They live by owning. They're capitalists. Marxism also taught us that because society is organized in order to make a profit for a few people, and because the economy functions so that these owners of means of production can enrich themselves, that because of that, it's deeply irrational. And it continues to have sporadic crises. Right? Marxism talks about the problem of overproduction, where the capitalist is constantly looking to drive wages down as low as possible and produce as much stuff as possible at the same time. And what's the result? Eventually, people can't buy back the product that they're producing, and so you have a crash, a glut. Marxism talked about the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat, the idea that the working class should rise up and seize control of these means of production and operate them rationally so that the standard of living of the people continued to rise. You didn't have these cyclical crises of overproduction, so that people weren't being exploited, so people were being taken care of, and the economy functioned in a rational way for the good of society. That's Marxism. Marxism argued that, you know, this dictatorship of the proletariat, this first stage of communism, would eventually give way to an even higher stage, you know, the highest stage of communism, that eventually, with the economy under the control of the people, without the irrational profit motive, eventually the standard of living would increase so high that any need for any kind of coercion or government would fade away. And people could just kind of live a comfortable life and take what they need and do what they feel like doing, from each according to his own ability, from each according to his needs. And that was the Marxist vision. And it was quite popular all throughout Europe. You had the formation of, you know, first the First International with Marx, which eventually collapsed as Marx was fighting with the anarchists. Then you had the rise of the Second International. You had the German Social Democratic Party that was formed. You had all kinds of political parties all throughout Europe. It was one of the biggest mass movements people had ever seen. These ideas, this idea that the working class should control the means of production, spread throughout Europe everywhere. But then you started to have, towards the beginning of the 20th century, what they called the Crisis of Marxism. And the Crisis of Marxism basically flowed from the fact that Marxist ideas were everywhere, trade unions were everywhere, democratic reforms were everywhere. A number of countries had universal male suffrage, which back then was considered to be a good thing. The fact that every man could vote, you know, the idea of giving women the right to vote was that was even far more extreme than they were even thinking. But a number of European countries had universal male suffrage. Socialist ideas were everywhere. Marxism was everywhere, but the revolution wasn't coming. So you had the crisis of Marxism. And there was a reason for that, which was Marx had predicted that the gap between the proletarians and the bourgeoisie would just continue to expand. And there would be greater poverty among the workers, greater wealth among the capitalists in Europe, and eventually the workers of Europe would just rise up and seize control of those factories, and that's how it would happen. But Marx didn't foresee the development of imperialism. Right? The capitalists in the Western countries had the ability to start expanding their power all across the globe. And instead of just exploiting the workers in Germany and France and Britain and the United States, they started exploiting the workers in Africa and in Asia, in South America, in the Middle East, and other parts of the world. And then what they were basically doing is they were going into these developing countries and they were holding back development. When the British went to India, India had a vast textile industry. They were, making all kinds of cloth very effectively, all kinds of looms. When the British went to India, what did they do? Now, did they go to India and say, all right, start making cloth for us, we're your colonizer? No, they did the opposite. They burned their looms down, and they forced them to import their cloth from Britain. We know about the Opium Wars, when China tried to protect its own domestic industries, tried to say that the importing of narcotics was not going to happen. So the British waged not one but two Opium Wars to force them to open and let the British businesses come out there and put them out of business. That's imperialism. And imperialism was not only a catastrophe in the developing world, but it also prevented any kind of revolutionary uprising from taking place in the homeland. Why? Because as the capitalists of the Western countries started making super profits and getting rich at the expense of people all over the world, they started to have more money, a lot more money, and they started to buy off sections of the working class at home. And so a lot of these working class people started to see their standard of living go up. And the working class got divided. And you had a development, especially among what they called skilled workers, trades, craftsmen. They basically got to the point that they were what you could call the aristocracy of labor, where they were workers, they were selling their labor power, but because their standard of living was going up, along with the capitalists colonizing the rest of the world, because their standard of living was increasing, they felt like imperialism and war was not so bad. And they sympathized more with their bosses than they did with people around the world who were struggling for the independence of their country. And so the working class in the Western countries became stratified because of imperialism. And so you didn't have, even though Marxist parties and Marxist ideas were everywhere in Europe, you didn't have the revolutions. It wasn't, Marx's vision didn't seem to be coming true. It was the crisis of Marxism. And the culmination of that crisis was in the lead up to World War I. All the socialist parties of the world pledged they would never support any capitalist war, right? The French, the Germans, the British, they all gathered. They said, we will never support a war of workers killing workers. It'll be solidarity. If they want a war, we'll turn the guns around. And then, when World War I broke out, the German Social Democrats voted to send Germans to go kill French workers. The French Social Democrats and Marxists voted to send French people to go kill Germans. The British Social Democrats, the American Social Democrats, a lot of them. You had some heroes like Eugene Debs and Rosa Luxemburg who stood firm and opposed the war. But for the most part, the socialist movement had become so tied in with imperialism that it refused to stop a brutal war. And thousands upon thousands and millions of people died in the First World War. And that was the crisis of Marxism. And Lenin had the understanding that because of imperialism, and because of the stratification of the working class, and because of the aristocracy of labor, that the revolutionary energy at that time was not going to be in the Western countries, as Marx had predicted. The revolution was going to come from the developing world. It wasn't going to come from the West, it was going to come from the East. And you had the Bolsheviks and Lenin, right? You had the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, was just your standard Marxist party, basically. It was a typical Marxist party. You agree with these principles, you can join, you pay your dues, whatever. Lenin gets his folks together and he says, we need a party of a new type, a party of people who give the whole of their lives, a party that practices democratic centralism. And he develops this whole new kind of a party, which basically fits with Russia's history and Russia's traditions. Russia has a long history of revolutionary conspiracies, like the Decembrists, for example, that tried to bring down Tsar Nicholas I, or famously there was the Old Believers, of Orthodox believers that refused to accept the reforms, of secret societies and such. And that was more fitting to Russia's conditions. When you have an overwhelming majority of the population that's illiterate, some kind of revolutionary conspiracy among the educated people who were embracing revolutionary ideology, it made sense. And you had the Bolsheviks seizing power in Russia, creating the Soviet Union. And I will talk, and I hate to hammer this point home, but I just can't not say this. It is my biggest pet peeve when I turn on the TV and people tell you that socialism failed, right? I've heard this my whole life, and whenever you go, it's like, I believe in socialism. Well, that failed. Everyone knows that didn't work. If you look at what the Soviet Union was able to achieve during the 1930s, you know, you can talk human rights criticisms, you can talk about things that they did wrong, but it was not an economic failure by any stretch of the imagination. This was a country that had been an agrarian economy. The overwhelming majority of the population was illiterate. Pretty soon, in the mid-1930s, during the 5-year plans, they had the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the entire world, right? They were producing more steel than any other country in the world. They eventually defeated the Nazis. They wiped out illiteracy in the country. Full employment, and eventually they were the first country in outer space. On the internet there's this meme, people will say, well, you know, he believes in socialism, but why does he have a cell phone? That's created by capitalism. Well, actually it's not. The first cell phone was created in the Soviet Union. The LED lights that are now used on smartphones were invented in the Soviet Union, right? You know, AK-47 rifles, the most efficient firearm in the history of the world. You can run over it with a tank and it still works, was invented in the Soviet Union. This idea that if you get rid of capitalism, no one ever has any creativity, everyone's just lazy and sits around, and that's just complete nonsense. It was with socialism that we saw Russia become a fully modern industrial country. If you look at what China has done, the reason that China is now the second largest economy in the world is also because of socialism, right? I mean, it was socialism that created the steel mills that now make half of the steel in the entire world. You know, Cuba, a tiny island in the Caribbean. It's known all over the world. No matter where you go in the world, people know about Fidel Castro. People know about the medical volunteers and the literacy volunteers that Cuba has created. You know, this idea that socialism was a big failure, I mean, it's like, I don't understand how people can say this. It's like the big lie, right? If you just repeat a big lie, a lie that's not even close to the truth, you just repeat it over and over again, people will believe it.